Good morning, everyone. This March 28th meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is convening via video conference pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021 as extended on July 16th, 2022. All participants are being recorded. This meeting is remote via Zoom, is posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording, so please silence all phones and devices. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full name for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or who acts inappropriately. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. For items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public that have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. If you're not able to participate in the remote meeting, you may also submit comments to the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, Leah Hill. Excuse me. Leah Hill, to be read aloud into the meeting record. Her email is lhill@nantucket-ma.gov. To confirm member access, I'm Mary Longacre, Chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. Permit me to confirm all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Okay, catching up here. I do not see Gary Beller. Sarah Boyce?
Here.
Peter Brace?
Here.
Matt Fee?
Here.
Rachel Freeman?
Here.
Dean Golding?
Here.
I do not see Jen Kerber yet. Christy Kickham?
Here.
I do not see Joanna Roach. Joe Topham, I think, is not able to join us at the beginning of the meeting, but might join us later. Staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Vince Murphy?
Here, Mary, and I think you missed Matt.
Matt, give us a quick hello. I apologize if I missed you.
Hello. You didn't miss me. Vince missed me.
We just missed you emotionally, Matt. Continuing with staff, Leah Hill, I believe, will be joining us later. And we do have Leslie Snell, Deputy Director of the Planning Department, joining us as a speaker as well.
Here.
And Jeff Carlson from the Natural Resources Department joining us as a speaker as well.
Good morning.
Good morning. Additional speakers, Charity Grace Mofson sent her regret she is unable to attend today. Kim Rose is the Preservation Manager for the Craig Group. Kim, hello again.
Hello.
And Chuck Larson is here, a Special Projects Manager for the town of Nantucket.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Chuck. Jen Carberg is joining us, so we will catch up with her in just a moment. We do have Shelley. Sorry, I'm looking for your last name, Shelley. Is Shelley still here?
Hi, good morning. I'm the new Coastal
Oh, there
Resilience
you are, Shelley
Specialist.
McComb.
Hi, I'm the Coastal Resilience Specialist with Woods Hole, Sea Grant, and Barnstable County. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Jen, do you want to say hello?
Morning, Mary.
And Joe Topham has also joined us.
Here.
Okay, did I miss anybody?
There's also Greg Berman.
Oh, Greg Berman. Thank you,
Also
Greg.
Matt, also Michelle. I'm the coastal.
We have a crowd this morning, so much appreciation to everybody who has joined us. So the topic for today's meeting is a focus on potential policy changes at the federal, state, and local level for coastal resilience purposes. I want to just set the stage a little bit. I included a few items on the agenda. They're not specific for discussion, but more for background information. The wetlands bylaw for the town of Nantucket, the Wetlands Protection Act from Mass General Laws, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers policy. So looking at the federal level, the Army Corps is becoming more flexible about being able to include nature-based solutions as opposed to simply hard infrastructure. So that is a positive trend, and some information on that. FEMA's flood insurance program, as we all know, is focused on putting back what was there before and has not had flexibility in the past to make changes to that. But again, they are starting to become a little bit more flexible in that respect. Local zoning, and then of course, any other applicable regulations. So for coastal resilience, there are essentially three possible approaches, and policies can impact one or more than one of those. So there's the approach to protect what is there at the coastline. There is the approach to retreat from the coastline to remove vulnerable assets. And there's the approach to prevent, so to not put new assets in harm's way. So generally speaking, those are the three different approaches that we can take, and all of them require some sort of policy as to which one is preferred or which one is most suitable in a particular environment. I know that some of our speakers have some time constraints. So Leslie, why don't we start with you? And can you tell us to start with, what can zoning accomplish, keeping in mind those three different lenses that we can look at coastal resilience by?
So, zoning can accomplish through, protecting existing resources, maybe setting, the current regulations and keeping those in place, not proposing new, more, I didn't know I was going to be a speaker. So Mary, sorry, I'm like fumbling around a little bit. So not proposing new, less restrictive regulations. So that's the one approach. The retreat, we could make restrictions more difficult for people to expand their properties. We could reduce the ground cover, we could do things like that, and then prevent, the zoning could be changed in a way that any new development would not be possible.
And can you speak about some of the zoning policies we have in place now that impact coastal resilience?
Sure. So over time, we've been rezoning areas that are, environmentally sensitive or that have, severe erosion issues to the lowest possible zoning district, which is the LUG 3 district. So for example, most of Smith's Point used to be in a 1/2 acre zoning district. We've now put it in a 3 acre zoning district. So that sort of gets at the retreating and preventing step out there, because, that is a volatile area, and, additional development probably shouldn't be encouraged out there. And we've done that in other areas of the island as well. We could, reduce ground cover in coastal locations. The planning board hasn't really taken a strong position on this, other than, the LUG 3 zoning around, sort of the periphery of the island. But it's certainly something that they could consider.
Thank you, Leslie. And any comments or questions on zoning from members of the committee that we can direct to Leslie?
And Mary, if I could just add, any zoning changes do require a 2/3 majority vote of town meeting. So, whatever is proposed, first of all, I think it's important that it's something that the planning board would support, because that usually helps at town meeting, but it's something that, the voters would have to support as well.
Thank you, Leslie. And I'll add, just as a side note, there's a fourth element to coastal resilience planning, and that is public education. And Leslie's point, that the public has to understand and accept any proposed changes. Public education is not in itself a policy issue, but it certainly is important to making policy changes. Let me pause. Joanna Roach is just joining us, so as soon as she is connected to audio, we'll note her. Joanna, can you say good morning? Joanna, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you for joining. Okay, so other than zoning, we also have Jeff Carlson here from the Natural Resources Department. Jeff, can you tell us about some of the town policies that you're aware of through your department that impact coastal resilience, and any potential changes that we might consider?
Sure, I'll try my best. I mean, it's a little bit of a loaded question for our department, obviously, because we have a lot of folks here and a lot of different hats and lenses. So I'll try to stay focused to the local wetlands bylaw and local regulations. And I know we got a lot of great folks from the Cape that have a lot of work with the state, and especially some potential updates to the flood zone regulations in the Wetlands Protection Act at the state level too. But locally here, obviously, we have our regular Wetlands Protection Act protection that's through the local bylaw that's here. So we're dealing with any of those resource areas or things within 100 feet of those resource areas. I know we've talked about that with this group before, so I won't bore you all the nitty-gritty details of it. But really, as we've started moving forward on a lot of this, one of the things that's come up in the last couple of years has been the need to start to build in some more flexibility or more accounting for resiliency and especially adaptation options within our local regulations. And I know our local Concom in the last really 8 to 12 months has been working on a draft, has gone as far as adopting a lot of language right from the coastal resiliency plan. So language related to things like actual just resiliency as a definition, or sea level rise and climate change comments are word for word from the CRP, which has been a huge help to put in. But in doing so, have kind of created a new interest. And for those not familiar with the wetlands protection bylaw, what you're really protecting in the resource areas are specific interests. So they might be fisheries or shellfishing or water quality or groundwater. And they've proposed in their new regulatory update to actually have an interest called resiliency. So as we're looking at the development of these properties in these sensitive areas, how are we making it resilient? You know, are we setting it up to be adaptable going forward? Are we setting it up to, you know, have people have the expectation of how can we, you know, have some strategic retreat? You know, how are we going to deal with that? And then provide ways to gain a waiver if necessary through the regulations to be able to accommodate that plan, or ways to get to it in advance. And I think that's really been kind of a big step. So I think, you know, help from from CRAC here, the best thing that was done was the plan itself, because it gave a source of consistent language to the commission to dovetail together. But I do think as, you know, as we kind of come online with some of these new things, and obviously as coastal protection strategies change over time, you know, having a good dialogue between Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee and the Conservation Commission is going to be absolutely critical to make sure that that review and that consistency is there as we kind of move through, you know, neighborhood by neighborhood or property by property. But I think we're off to a really good start. But there's still lots to do. But I won't bore everyone with a Wetlands Protection Act breakdown for 30 minutes because everyone will be asleep.
Thank you, Jeff. Questions or comments from commissioners for Jeff? Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So Jeff, I'm just curious, you know, I think what you said about the coastal resiliency plan really helping with some of that common language as you guys work towards the regulatory update. You know, some aspects of that of the plan are like undefined, you know, so your example of managed retreat, like we know it's got to happen in some way, but it hasn't been fleshed out obviously at any level. So I guess like which comes first? I know we're all talking together, like this is something that the CRAC committee has worked on or talked about, and like we're trying to learn from other communities. There's, you know, there's so much information to learn. I'm just curious, and that's just one example, but like as you move through this with your regulatory update, I guess first question is, where are you guys in that process? Or are you, you know, planning on reaching out to CRAC with like certain topics that we, you know, maybe we can help flesh out more, you know, kind of where do you see that coming together? Or is it like not happening now in like 5 years or something?
No, I honestly, I'll try to answer those in order as best I can, but to answer the last question first, I think the answer to that is it all has to happen now, and those conversations all have to start, because if we wait 5 years, that's 5 years that are lost. And for as slow as government tends to move, if we wait that long, you know, that 5 years in real world terms is like 10. So that's just the unfortunate nature of that. But I do think where we are in the process right now is the commission finished kind of a draft based upon commission discussion through their public meeting process on that. And then before any regulation comes back for its actual formal public hearing, we always send it off to town council for review, just to make sure that everything is legal and nothing's crazy. And right now those regulations are with town council. And as soon as we have an indication of when those will be back, I'm sure we'll have at least a couple of public hearings. I think that would really give an opportunity to, break out some of the changes specific to resiliency to get comments from you guys on. I mean, I don't necessarily think you need to be burdened with the entire document and talk about, viewshed management standards for vegetated wetlands in the middle of the island. We can break out the topics that are specific for you guys. But I think getting your comment and input would be really helpful, and at least to review. I mean, we do have a member on this committee, so hopefully we're bringing comments to you from there and comments back from you guys back to them, and that interaction's happening the way it should be, and I feel like it is. But I think we're at the point where, obviously, especially for things like strategic retreat, really putting together a comprehensive program for people to understand what's going to be involved, because it's not just a Concom permit, right? Is you're going to have to deal with HDC permitting, you're going to have to go get building permits, you might have to get, relief from zoning, depending upon how you're going to relocate and do things, right? All of those things are going to have to kind of work hand in hand. So getting that all together and on paper for people and give them the tools to actually do it's going to be kind of critical. And I think we're at the point where that needs to happen.
Thank you, Jeff. Sarah, any follow-up, or should I go to the next person? Okay, Peter?
No, thanks.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for being here. Maybe this is really obvious or not. Your jurisdictional boundaries are going to change as the water comes up. You're 100, you're 50, you're 25. Has the commission talked about that? Are they thinking about that? Is that a new concept to them? I'm just looking for your thoughts on it.
No, it's definitely something that, especially in the last few years, has come up quite a bit. And I think that's one of the real beauties of the way that the wording of the state act and local bylaw are written, is the resource areas are defined not by a fixed map outside of like the flood zone, where it's kind of set over time for the 100-year floodplain. But if a salt marsh migrates landward, the jurisdictional lines migrate landward, and you're either in or you're out. And I think that built-in flexibility is helpful. I do think, though, and this is kind of a personal narrative, I guess, is having a way to better allow or create performance standards to better allow for resource area migration, especially coastal resource areas. Primarily, really our big migratory ones on the coast are really salt marsh and coastal dune, tend to really get going. But how to deal with that over time. There are lots of other issues, and I don't want to steal anyone else's thunder because we have far better people than me to talk about this on the line. But I think, thinking kind of on a larger Massachusetts scale, is the discussion really needs to be had and kind of solved what we're going to start to do with areas that there are structures in place, whether it's a bulkhead or a living shoreline, or what's going to happen where the natural shoreline is going to erode obviously much faster than somewhere that's protected. What do you do with all these legacy structures that are there that start to become more and more like a peninsula? And how are you going to adapt those to the environment over time? Understanding that's a little bit of a scary subject too, right? Because there's a lot of stuff laying around. I know we've talked about it a lot at the commission and had some areas where it's come up about how to convert existing uses to, better technologies that are in place now. But again, I think that's all stuff that can get hashed out through discussion and hopefully some guidance from the state. And then provide some consistency across the state for how those are being interpreted or how those are being managed. But that's a much larger discussion than probably what we're going to have today.
Thank you, Jeff. Vince, did you want to add anything from the coastal resilience plan? Jeff, alluded to it. Are there policy changes that we're specifically calling out in the plan?
Yes, and there's a couple that this committee has had interest in and worked on in the past, and including sea level rise into things like the Town's Wetland Protection Act, but also the higher level at the State Wetland Protection Act and other areas as well. That's something the committee has expressed quite a bit of interest in. Understanding future floodplains and where water will be, could also benefit the commission to try and have some predictive role in where management might need to take place into the future, and understanding how well we deal with sea level rise, what is acceptable and what it's not. The next thing that I keep banging the drum for this one, and the more and more I look at it, the more and more I see it's needed, is the retreat and relocation planning. Having the Conservation Commission as part of that and advising in towards that project as well, to understand how to retreat and how to strategically retreat from certain areas, or where retreat isn't the option, and have input from commissions as to how for areas that retreat is not an option or not immediately an option, and how long we can stay in certain areas before we have to consider the next potential plan, which may be retreat or some other defensive mechanism. That's another big one. That's kind of the main ones that I would kind of hit for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Vince. We also have Chuck Larson here, our Special Projects Manager for the town. Chuck, do you want to share some of your thoughts based on, working, boots on the ground on some of these projects?
Right. So, yeah, thank you, Mary. So, yeah, I'm looking at the agenda item and, potential policy changes or regulations. I'm wondering if we're kind of missing a step in the sense that that's kind of the enforcement level, but how about taking a step back and just basic, guidelines, local design guidelines or local design best practices in terms of setting things into action before you make them enforceable. And one thing that kind of comes to mind is like, go down to Easy Street, look at the bulkheads. Each bulkhead is at a different elevation, right? And, on some level, I think we're missing an opportunity that, hey, based on criticality, we should be considering, basic, thresholds in terms of when we design, for particular, infrastructure. Same thing with homes, you've certainly got the FEMA requirements, but then adding freeboard, it seems it's up to the individual to, decide on, well, do I want 1 foot freeboard or do I want to do more? And I'd like to see, maybe, some thinking along the lines of, just what are some good base, best practices. And certainly we're going to be seeing more of, high tide flooding. And, how do we, prepare the community for that? And, how do we quantify that in the areas where we're going to start seeing increased flooding and, just basic levels of inundation? And, what levels of inundation are considered a concern and might warrant, more immediate action. I think we do definitely need to be moved toward policy and regulations, but I'm also thinking that, there just needs to be some basic guidance and advice for people out there as we start to really wrestle with this. I think, I'd like to hear more from the other people as well. This is a tough subject and, there's a lot to consider here, and public education is a huge piece of this as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. I'll go to Peter.
Yeah, Chuck, thanks for being here. And I guess this is directed at you, but maybe Mary as well. Shouldn't the HDC be here? If Chuck is talking about guidelines, then maybe we're probably definitely talking about amendments, additions to building with Nantucket in mind as it relates to houses that are right there or structures that are right there. So just my thoughts.
Thank you, Peter. Since you called me out, there is the Resilient Nantucket project that Holly Backus did. And that's the goal of that project, is to define historically appropriate ways for adaptation for the sea level rise and flooding challenges. So yes, we haven't forgotten them. They're not here today, though. You're right.
If I could just follow up, I'm just saying that having something in building with Nantucket in mind puts it right into people who are considering a project. They are looking at it. That's another thing they have to consider. So.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Go to Ian.
Thank you, Mary. Through you to, I guess, both Matt and Jeff. So I was specifically talking about the peninsula effect and the letters and the discussion that we've had within Concom about Chapter 91 licenses that bulkheads that are protecting houses that are no longer, that are post 78 structures. And I was wondering whether the letter we wrote that we asked the select board to consider and mail on to DEP, whether there'd been any response at all, because that sort of hits on how do you create policy change across different branches of government within the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Jeff or Matt?
I can answer from our end. We have not received anything today.
Vince?
Yeah, and I don't think, I haven't heard anything from Libby either. I don't think we've received anything either.
Thank you, Matt. Go to Vince.
And the follow-up letter that Crack sent in early December has also not had a response that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Vince.
So I guess, if I may, Mary, so I think, that's an object lesson of how difficult some of these subjects are going forward, to have sort of cross-pollinization between government departments. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Sarah.
Thank you, Mary. I just want to say, I think I really appreciate Chuck's point of taking 2 steps back before we, jump in too far, because I think this is a great meeting to have, to see all the players that can have input on these kind of regulation changes and kind of start to the discussion, but also as a non-regulatory committee and the work we can do. I think having these types of meetings and discussions are really important, but I want to see action too, right? Like, I want to be useful. And so exactly what Chuck was talking about, I think I want to hear from those who have more of that regulatory standpoint or function, what would be useful for this group to work on. So whether it's that a guidelines, a set of guidelines that can ultimately be put in front of the HDC. We have to have something and have either a draft of a product or something to put in front of many of these groups. And so I think, like, I really appreciate what Chuck is saying. And I think maybe either Jeff Carlson or the Concom has something that they would like a product they would like to see that would be helpful to add to the resource area work. Like, if obviously, with, as Jeff was saying, with the changing of the wetland layer built into how the regulations are, that makes sense, that there's the water is going to migrate and just change the area in itself. But if there's mapping changes that need to happen to, like, the dune systems or something, I don't know, I'm just throwing things out there, but that's where I feel like we could be useful as a committee, is what do the players in this meeting now need that could be discussed at a group like the Coastal Resiliency Committee, and we can use our expertise or what we know from years of doing this, that we can, like, provide information. And we are an advisory committee, so I want to kind of put that out there. And that's all.
Thank you, Sarah. Before we go to Matt, does anybody want to respond to Sarah? Okay, Matt, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm kind of responding to Sarah, I think. And also a bit to Ian. It is, the difficulty is that there are 2 or 3 different people, different entities responsible for different aspects. So there are things that we are, as a town, either they come to us, and this isn't to pick on anything, but should we be putting, sewer in Mattakit? Should we be building swimming pools in the dunes? Should we be, and when we say that, it's like, well, nothing you can do. And I think there is something we could do. We can go short of regulation. We can advise against it because here's what's happening, or we can eventually make changes to regulation. I think that what kind of is missing is people understanding what and where is in trouble. Like, we all understand it. Or we think we understand it. We've seen plenty of maps and we've looked at the future, et cetera. That future isn't baked in everywhere else yet. And I think, it would be interesting at some point to do some sort of consensus building or something, and just pick one area, put it on a map and say, what are the things that happen now that, we would like to discourage? What are the things we want to do more of? like some sort of, think it through so that, because then there could be some buy-in. If you're specifically saying, oh, we're just taking this away, people will say, why are you doing it? If you say we're doing X, Y, and Z so that this area lasts longer, and so that, so you don't spend a lot of money and then have to retreat, then I think there's more sort of buy-in to it, more understanding that it isn't to take things away from people, it's to prepare. So I'm looking at it that way. There's a lot of things a lot of projects, a lot of things we do that cut across multiple jurisdictions, and that's lost sometimes. And it comes to the select board, it comes to us, and we're sitting there going, well, really, there's not much we can do. We'd like to do something. Yeah, that makes sense, but our hands are tied, so how do we sort of get everyone on the same page?
Thank you, Matt. Before we go to Joanne and Vince, I want to ask Leslie if she can talk a little bit about the process for drafting a new zoning bylaw. If we were to look at an area and, as Matt was saying, decide that there's something that we do or don't want to do in that area, what is the process for creating that new bylaw?
Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer without knowing what you would be proposing. But you could create a new section of the bylaw that addressed certain aspects of coastal resiliency, or you could identify some overlay districts that are more restrictive than the underlying zoning. You could make some new districts, I suppose, but either way, the article would have to be zoning. It would go through the planning board for a public hearing. It would be supported by the planning board or not, and then it would require a 2/3 majority at town meeting. And I think this is a really good time to point out that, regulatory changes can't result in properties being unbuildable, because then that results in a taking. So you have to be really cautious about, some of the approaches and what the result is. And I think we've seen down at Brant Point, people are willing to make substantial investments to keep their property usable. And if you all have been down there recently, it's really surprising the amount of investment that's being made right along the coastline. But that's, what people want to do in certain areas. And we have to think about the implications of changing zoning and other regulations as well.
Thank you, Leslie. We'll go to Joanna.
Hi, thanks. I also agree with Jeff, no, sorry, Sarah, and also the comments about the order of operations and what we're trying to focus on. Because I feel like, to Sarah's point about us being useful, we don't have an order of operations in terms of what we need to focus on first. And I know we're today trying to gather some of that information, and I think people have different ideas, but where's the place where we can have the most impact? And where are the places that need change or change architecture first, right? So I would love to hear from some of the folks here about their opinions about, in their particular areas, what might need to be done first in order to address the larger picture, if that makes sense to you all.
Thank you, Joanna. Let's go to Vince, and then because we're still sort of continuing that conversation, and then we'll open it up to Joanna's question.
If you want to just defer to Joanna's question, I'm happy to wait. I was going to go back to something Matt said, but I'm happy to leave it.
Okay, so Joanna, do you want to state your question again, or I'll take a stab at trying to state it, whichever way you prefer.
I think, you know what, Mary, I'd love to have your comment, but I think in the big picture, what we need to do is establish the order of operations to what we're trying to accomplish. And having everyone on this call is awesome, but each person really needs to say, in your area, what are the things that you think is important in order for us to make a list of things that need to be addressed? And then we can kind of prioritize them and come up with an order in which we as a committee can review the information and make any recommendations or suggestions as appropriate. Is that clear to?
I think that was very well stated. Thank you. Is there anyone that wants to respond to that question? And that may require some thought, and that's a good topic for another meeting. We are trying to stay focused on policy change as a topic in and of itself today. But I certainly want to, if people have thoughts about high priority changes, certainly want to welcome answers to Joanna's question. All right, Joanna, I think people need to think about that for a while before they can answer. So I think Vince will go back to you, and then I want to open up to the public for some questions, since I think we have all of our local officials who have now spoken.
Sure, thanks, Mary. So Matt had said about looking at an area and looking at how what we would do for that area and how we could include that into zoning. And then Leslie kind of hit half of what I was going for. She talked about Brant Point, and the newspaper put it out there that there's roughly about 150 million in redevelopments in the waterfront area right there between the hotel and several private homes. But if we had, as a suggestion, zoning for waterfront areas and near shore areas, where if you not only increase the resilience for your home, but also increase area resilience, like we missed an opportunity to be able to do one long bulkhead all the way down all those properties that are going through redevelopment at the moment. But if we were able to have a bulkhead like that for wave attenuation or for decreasing flow into the roadway, not the area in general, just the roadway, then we could gain benefit from it. At the same time as the homeowner is also creating resilience for their own home in a different way. But that's the kind of change that I would like to see. It would be tricky, and trying to work out how it would work in terms of the Wetland Protection Act would also be a question as well as zoning. So that's the kind of opportunity that I would like to see.
Thank you, Vince. I want to ask Joe Topham a question. Joe is our planning board member. So Joe, when projects like the individual properties on Brant Point come to the planning board, or do they come to the planning board, do you have the ability to look at a neighborhood focus, or are you limited to looking at just what's before you on that single project?
Kind of really depends on the application, but most projects would, I'd say, would have to go through the ACC review, like what impacts, the surveyor on site, kind of go through that. But I think Jeff can bring up Pocomo, where a group of homeowners got together. I think, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, like 88 to 110 or whatever it was. They all got together except for like one guy in the middle, but they all got together and how do we combat this together? And they came up with a group plan, and Arcus Sparrow came forward. So I think if, you get that village or street, group effort, that really helps out a lot, because if one person's not participating, that's a weak link, or they're against the project. And this is where I think you need to really kind of together as a group, like Holbert Ave or Easton Street, have a cohesive plan that everyone's kind of working together and everyone is approving and everyone's working on it. And I think then you come in the planning board and it's like, okay, well, this is the major projects are going to go on. These are the impacts. This is what's going to happen here. And then of course there's all the architectural concerns, but I think that that's less, I trust the designers, the ACC, that something's going to look good, but it's how do you make it function properly and everyone is working together. But, as Jeff could tell you in that Pocomo project, there was, everyone's project was working well. They had some sand mitigation put in, a year or two later, but the one gentleman that didn't want to pay for the core rolls system, you could see early retreat and quite quickly within those couple of years. So I haven't been out there in a while, but I'd love to check it out and see what's going on. But I think the whole thing is come together as a group, really comes and helps out the planning board go forward with their process and checking boxes, et cetera, and then giving our comments. And so that would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Joe. We will go to Rachel and Matt before we go to the public. Rachel?
Thank you, Mary. First of all, I guess what I'd like to say is that I'm very grateful for this discussion. It is huge to look at regulations, particularly local regulations, and listening to everyone discuss how changes can be made and the challenges of making changes is just a really helpful way of looking at this. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. And then the other piece that I just wanted to put out there, and I'm circling back to what Ian said earlier, and this is just personal experience working through land bank. is that we actually, or my personal experience is that I feel like we have hit more hurdles or blocks or, you know, complete stops with DEP lately than we have at the local level. And I know it's way more difficult to affect change at a state level, but I see that as something that needs to be impacted, because ultimately, you know, we can do everything we want here, and then we can go to DEP and a project can completely die. And that's something that I think maybe CRAC needs to think about, even if it's not a today discussion, because I do understand that this is one step further even, you know, Chuck's saying we should back up, and I agree with him, but this is the next level where we're really seeing some problems. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll go to Matt and then Joe.
Yeah, my thought is, sorry. Yeah, mine was kind of to follow up a little bit on what Joe was saying. I think this has to be looked at from a neighborhood perspective and not just the 5 neighbors that want to do it. It has to be everybody. And I think what the land bank did down in Washington Street, where they looked at various options and they said, this is likely the best option as long as we put a bulkhead over, you know, put a gate over here to stop the water coming from Candle Street. That if you had something similar for Brant Point, and anyone that came in to make changes at Brant Point was handed the study saying, yep, here's what we're recommending to do. This is where our long-term vision, or our medium and short-term vision for here is, with the bulkhead, with less, with less hardscaping, with more water flow, whatever the plan came up with. I think people would more likely follow that. And I think that's sort of, and I'm not talking, some of this is regulation, sort of if we're doing shoreline setbacks or rebuilding restrictions or TDRs and things, those are all sort of regulatory, or rolling easements, et cetera, that kind of stuff. But if we're just saying, hey, this is where this is going, and this is how we'd like it, these are the issues we'd like to address. We don't even have to get to the regulatory portion, necessarily, but get to the vision portion. What are we doing in these various areas? And that, to me, and it has to be done by the neighborhood. And after that, I would like to talk about TDRs at some point, but let's go on to someone else.
Okay, I do want to make sure the public has the opportunity to ask questions. I know that not everybody is able to stay for the whole meeting. So I'm going to pause here and ask if there are members of the public in attendance that have questions, in particular for the town officials who have already spoken, before we expand the discussion. We will get back to Joe and Jeff to respond, but I just do want to offer the public the opportunity. You can go ahead and use the raise hand feature in Zoom, or you can also unmute and just let us know that you want to ask a question. And just a reminder that you should be using your full name in Zoom so that we know who you are.
Yes, Mary, it's Deanne.
Deanne, go ahead. Deanne Atherton, go ahead.
Yes, through you, Mary, to Rachel. Could Rachel just give us an example or two of more specifics of the roadblocks they're running into with DEP?
Dan, I'm going to ask to pause on that response since it's not a local question. I don't want to not have your question answered, but I do want to make sure that our local officials have the opportunity to answer any questions. We're about to move into the topic of DEP. So,
all right, thank you. Okay.
Any other members of the public present who have questions in particular for local officials? All right, I am not seeing any indication of that. Joe, go ahead with your comments.
Oh, thank you. To just kind of springboard off of Rachel's comment, when the SPPF came before the Concom, when I was on there, Ben Shampoo asked Land Council's representative Trey Ruffian, sorry, I'm butchering his name, but very intelligent gentleman. But Ben asked him a direct question: what would you do if not geotubes? And he said, a breakwater, wall or something. But he said you'd never get a Chapter 91 license. And at that point, it kind of seemed like if the town of Nantucket doesn't come forward, every board, and really says, we need this, we're gonna, you know, curve the Concom rules regulations so that we can do this, and the pre-78 homes or post-78 homes are going to be afforded protection. I think that we need to come together as a group and all groups, because Rachel's experienced exactly what's happening. Okay, that's just one little small part, but I think if we're going to go forward and advise the town, I think everyone needs to come forward and really kind of get behind it. And maybe it's writing a letter as the land bank is making a presentation saying, we endorse this project. It's been before us. We recommend that, you know, this is a possible solution to a major problem. And, you know, we have our full support behind the land bank. So I really think that that's something, you know, Rachel's bringing up a issue that we could probably address sooner than later and help a lot of these projects move forward through some of these, you know, really long, arduous red tape projects and processes. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Jeff or Vince, did you have further comments that you wanted to offer?
I just had one quick one. I think it's also important to remember too, that at a local level, we can make more restrictive regulations than what the state has. The state is the minimum bar for what we have to do. And we can be more restrictive, but we can't relax state standards, even if we think it makes sense for what we're doing. Because that's what it is. But that's why I'm really interested. I know we're moving into that portion, and not to put poor Greg and Shelley on the spot here, but I think the real best opportunity for us isn't to necessarily tackle these issues just as Nantucket. The Cape and the Vineyard and lots of coastal Massachusetts are going to be viewing the same problems. And I know they're all a little bit different, right? If you go up to Rockport, Mass, where they have these great, you know, bluffs that are made of rock that don't erode, it's a lot different than out here, but a lot of these questions are going to be the same. And I really think if we're really going to talk about trying to effectively move the needle at the state level, I think getting it to a scale and getting more folks involved, at least to give us the tools to maybe regulate it a little bit differently locally. I think getting all of us together and kind of looking at it in some sort of common lens, I think is going to be really important to do. Because if not, it falls into, well, Nantucket's just complaining because they're having issues and they can't figure it out. But if we can get Barnstable and Mashpee and, you know, the Vineyard and everyone together to say, we need guidance and help on this, I think they listen better. But hopefully we can get there.
Thank you, Jeff. So one of the things that I would like to see is that the state, what I've heard is that Massachusetts is one of the most restrictive states in terms of protecting the environment, which is not in and of itself a bad thing at all. But we are running into these issues where protecting property, whether it's infrastructure that's municipally owned or it's private homes, is, it's becoming a higher priority. So I would love to see the state create some kind of a pilot program where perhaps with municipal property and infrastructure protection, you're allowed to test some new strategies that didn't exist when the regulations were originally written. That might give us, more information about whether or not they're beneficial or harmful or cost effective. I'd like to see the state consider, ways that we can work together on some of these issues instead of being so extremely restrictive. But, we have to play the hand we're dealt. So as I mentioned previously, we have seen a trend for FEMA and for the Army Corps of Engineers to begin to consider natural solutions as opposed to only either putting back what was there before or building hard infrastructure in the case of the Corps. What I had heard from Charity Grace Moffson is that DEP does have some new regulations under development. Unfortunately, she was not able to provide any information about what those regulations address. So I don't even know if they are relevant to what we're talking about. But I would like to ask the participants today if anybody has more information about how DEP may be considering changing their regulations. And in particular, perhaps some of the individuals who are not based on Nantucket might have some information, whether that's from the Sea Grant or Kim Rose, who has worked on a number of projects regionally and internationally now. Does anyone have more information specifically about Mass DEP or more generally about changes that might already be underfoot or underway, excuse me, at the state level? Greg?
Yep, so Woods Hole Sea Grant is not a state agency. We work with a lot of the state agencies. And I mean, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to speak specifically to what DEP is or isn't doing. I know there are some regulatory changes in the works. I mean, land subject to coastal storm flowage has been in the works for many decades. And it was a very near thing. It's been a near thing many times. With a new governor coming in, it might be a near thing again. So how long we wait for that is anyone's guess. So, I mean, it's not just necessarily DEP that's the regulatory agency that may be the permitting agency for, for example, living shorelines, right? You've got DMF, you've got DEP, you've got Chapter 91. There's a whole variety. So it would be a multi-agency effort that you would kind of need to address. I know DEP does have some limited ecological restoration, and I guess that's kind of one question I had. I don't know if Nantucket's particular bylaw or regs might not have a waiver in place already for, most waivers there for things that make sense, for this project doesn't meet our regs, but it's better for the environment than the existing. So maybe your regs kind of address those already. There is some carve out in the state language for that also, but there really isn't a easy way for permitting. Again, example, living shorelines, just because I think that was discussed earlier. Like right now, from the state point of view, it's much more difficult to permit a living shoreline than it is just a rock revetment. And I think that might be something that, you could work with. I mean, the three counties, Nantucket, Dukes, and Barnstable, could have a pretty strong voice if you wanted to kind of flip that around. Sea Grant and other agencies have definitely talked to the state about that. And there is, their heart's in the right place in a lot of ways. They all have their very specific, whether it's eelgrass or shellfish or the other natural resources. And there's a lot of give and take they're trying to protect. But with living shorelines and other things, I mean, you are going to impact, land under the ocean. Whether that's more valuable than a beach is up to that particular agency. So I'm sorry that was kind of long-winded, but there's no clear carve out for these kinds of things that I have heard that are coming up. But I know certain agencies, CZM, one of them, is a little bit more amenable or reasonable towards, green infrastructure versus our typical gray. So there are some agencies who want it. It's just that, even the different parts of the state don't all agree with each other.
Thank you, Greg. And I will mention, we reached out to CZM multiple times to try and get a representative at this meeting, and we're not successful. So we'll continue that effort and follow up with them at a future time. Jeff?
Yeah, I was just gonna add on to what Greg said a little bit, because we've seen this kind of firsthand as well, where it can get very frustrating navigating through all of the state agencies because you have competing interests that don't always get along. I mean, I'll use a project that's active for us where we've been talking about doing a living shoreline and then a constructed oyster reef as a breakwater in Sacajah Pond. And the Division of Marine Fisheries is adamant that we don't add oysters to that pond because the water body is restricted. Now, there are oysters naturally that occur in there, and we're creating habitat, but we can't supplement using our existing hatchery for fear that apparently people are going to go harvest oysters. And that comment kind of derailed that project for a little while and moved because we couldn't overcome that hurdle until we convinced them that we were just gonna put in extra habitat, but there's no consistent vision from the state on what's allowable, and it gets tough to navigate at times. So they're on kind of a similar learning curve to all of us too, and they do try their best, but I think all of it just needs to get updated to 2023 and not 1972 when it came into being, you know, so.
Thank you, Jeff. We'll go back to Greg.
Yep, so I've certainly had conversations with state agencies. I think they're kind of sick of me bringing it up, but I keep saying, you know, down in the Chesapeake region where a lot of the living shoreline science got, you know, invented, perfected, or really put into policy. There are regulations in place down there where you have to show that a living shoreline won't work before you can do a revetment or bulkhead. So that's not where we are here in Massachusetts. We're very protective, very restrictive, and I do feel that the state agencies may be a little terrified of opening up their regulations, because there probably will be certain groups that once they're open, if they get loosened per se for living shorelines, they could be loosened entirely. So that may be part of their reluctance to crack them open.
Thank you, Greg. I don't want to forget Deanne Atherton's question. Rachel, did you want to respond to her question about more specifics in the roadblocks that you encountered?
I can. I actually, the most recent that's on the top of my head is not exactly a coastal resiliency project, but with the work that we're doing at Lily Pond. And, you know, stormwater has been existing and coming into that area for probably over 100 years. And we ran into some hurdles when we wanted to put in forebays and basically convert lawn back to wetland area. But, you know, we wanted to reconvert it, but we also wanted to actually funnel stormwater through it to allow filtration and, you know, sediment removal and all these different attenuation, all these different processes that we're trying to foster. And you are not allowed to put stormwater directly into wetland. However, there is already stormwater going directly into that wetland in any number of ways. So, you know, we stepped our project around, and it's like, it was just kind of an ongoing conversation. And they did say they're updating their regulations, and I don't know to what tune, but it's just hitting that roadblock where this is the regulation. We don't have any flexibility surrounding it, which, you know, as Greg said, I totally understand why and where they exist, you know, but it does make it kind of challenging because environmentally, it's totally the right thing to do. And it's like, we're completely ignoring that the existing conditions that are there are in violation. And yet it's just like this really backwards, upside down thing. But I get it. I get where regulators have an incredibly tough job. And once you set precedent by saying, oh yeah, you can do it, you know, all of a sudden you've broken the regulations and you're loosening those reins, as Greg described, and there's consequences to that. And there's consequences that I'm sure I don't even understand. But I know they're big. So anyways, that's one example, not particularly pertaining to coastal resiliency, but it's an example of sort of wanting to do the right thing environmentally and just hitting in a pre-permitting meeting, just hitting like this total roadblock. Like that's not going to work. You're going to have to come up with a different plan. So.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll go to Kim Rose.
Thank you. So actually, Rachel, the project that you were talking about with having water drain directly or that kind of water drain directly into a wetland is actually a project that was approved in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a community that I worked in. I was working on their strategic historic preservation plan. And it was called, and this is something that South Florida Regional Planning Council, which is essentially a few counties in the south of Florida, got together and said, you know what, we're going to stop planning as individual places because it's not working. We're going to start planning as the counties as a collective. And so they adopted this idea of adaptation action areas, and they've done this since 2011. And it is flexible optional framework that is then applied to projects. And it's interestingly enough, when we were doing the strategic historic preservation plan for the city, we found that almost every single one of those adaptation action areas was in a historic district, near a historic resource, or within an archaeology zone. Because that's where critical infrastructure is. It's in the older parts of the town because it's older infrastructure. And so it was fascinating to see what they were doing with that wetland and how effective it was, because what they ended up doing is turning it into drinking water and using it again and again and again and cycling it through that same wetland system. And this is something I've also seen happen in Texas as well, when I was working on this again and again and again. And these adaptation action areas are phenomenal because they have 4 steps. You have a building of context. So getting a steering committee to look at the area that's being worked on, setting principles and the motivations for the project itself. Why is it needed? Why is it being done? What is the planning context for it? And then identifying the opportunities for community participation right up front. So that the community has that buy-in that Matt was talking about and that ownership over the project. And then doing a vulnerability assessment, looking at the exposure, the impact, and assigning focus areas to do sampling for the project. And then doing the adaptation strategies, looking at the capacities, looking at the prioritization of needs. Because like I always say, when I talk to different groups, you can't do everything, you can't fix everything. It has to be prioritized, and then identifying the adaptation strategies to address what is prioritized. And then finally, the implementation strategies, actually it and creating a monitor and evaluation in these. And it's a system that's been used pretty effectively in Fort Lauderdale that I've seen, and within the South Florida Regional Planning Council. But what helps them is planning for it. Because I also say, if you don't know what you have, you can't plan for it, you can't get funding, and you can't do it. So you have to make sure that you understand what you have in order to create those design guidelines, in order to have your public participation. And luckily, Nantucket is highly studied. You have the Nantucket Preservation Trust, the Preservation Institute Nantucket, the Coastal Resilience Plan, and those types of other resources. You have research from the Conservation Foundation and the Nantucket Land Bank on the natural resources that exist. And of course, Linda Loring Foundation as well. And that's fantastic because you already have a leg up on so many communities that I work with. It's amazing. And then you can take that and go talk to Boston, go talk to Miami, go talk to Schenectady, New York, go talk to Charleston, go talk to areas on the Cape, go talk to Martha's Vineyard and say, this is the data that we have. What's the data that you have? And how can we work together to fund these solutions or to fund these approaches? And that's typically the process that we use. I don't look at just one place when I do any of my plans, when I'm looking at policy. I'm looking at everywhere around it, and then places across the country that are the same size, have similar demographics, have similar conditions, and that kind of stuff, because they may approach it completely different. And I don't believe in looking at just one place. It is looking at 50 to 80 plans per project that I do in order to make sure that we are looking at best practices. We are looking at what's working and what's not working. But yeah, and I think just breaking down communication silos. I mean, that's the reason that I had Acclimate started, was to bring people to the table. And maybe, I know Will's on the call, so I'm going to put him on the spotlight, but having an Acclimate policy forum and talking about that and bringing the state in and having conversations and maybe meetings monthly and those kinds of things to just make those conversations happen, because sometimes they're not going to happen organically because people get busy. But if they have a meeting on their calendar and they can't schedule anything else during that time, then they're more likely to show up.
Thank you, Kim. And just to reiterate, Kim did work on the Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation project here on Nantucket. And I hope that is being used as an example for other communities.
It is. Matter of fact, I'm applying for the Charleston is now doing a second iteration of their design guidelines. And so we're using Nantucket as a model for them, because their previous design guidelines were only focusing on elevation, and they realized, oh, that's not very affordable. And so now it's looking at wet flood proofing, dry flood proofing, and natural and hybrid approaches to historic resources. So it's definitely a model.
Thank you, Kim. Other perspectives at the state level for either the potential for policy change or roadblocks that we're facing. Jen, perhaps the Conservation Foundation has a perspective you'd like to share?
Sure, Mary. Perspective and experience, I guess. I think at least what we've encountered at the state level, we've encountered at the local level very, very supportive of nature-based solutions when we're thinking about adapting to climate change, sea level rise, erosion, that kind of thing. But our roadblocks have been at that state level. And it's been at the state level as far as thinking about new and innovative solutions, which I think is one of the things that we're kind of hoping starts to come out of, or has come out of the CRP, and how we respond to thinking about protecting our shorelines if we're trying to do living shorelines or other things similar to the project that Jeff, described. The Conservation Commission went through getting our Oyster Castle oyster reef permitted and installed, 2.5 years ago or so now. And it was the first one in the state, and we had to bring, forward examples from Chesapeake Bay and other places. And it was definitely a slog getting it through the permitting process on a pilot project basis. And that was pulling, forward the results that other people had seen other places. What we've seen is that the state doesn't say no to these kind of pilot projects that haven't been done in Massachusetts before, but they're very reluctant to permit new and innovative technologies. I think about, thin layer deposition in salt marshes, which is one of the ways that, other states have explored and researched and experienced ways to help salt marshes adapt to sea level rise. It's maybe being permitted in Massachusetts sometime, this year, but that's through the pushing of organizations that, are trying to do those projects, have the funding and the time to push for that. And that really has been that roadblock, is that there's an amount of money that it takes to go through the permitting process. So that halts a private property owner or a neighborhood from doing this kind of neighborhood level planning that we're talking about and going after getting permitting for solutions. There's a large cost to that. So there's a disparity in individuals or neighborhoods that could go after that. There's a time component, how much time you can actually spend on trying to get something permitted that hasn't been permitted before, and then collect the required data to go back to the state to, emphasize, what we're learning from this so that other people could implement it. Those are kind of the roadblocks we're seeing. They're not insurmountable, but it takes, particular groups pushing. I do know that there are groups in Massachusetts that are interested in doing living shorelines. The SNEP group has a salt marsh working group in it that are working together to go to these different state agencies and start talking about how we can get something like what you talked about, Mary. How can we get, an easier permitting pathway for pilot projects? Pilot projects are projects where you do it on a small scale and test out and monitor and see what the results are. So there are groups that are pushing that. I think for us as the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, it might be interesting to figure out how we can give support to those groups. We haven't really been active in that kind of, lobbying for change. I know that, working at the Conservation Commission, we haven't been active in that kind of lobbying for change. We're on working groups and pushing forward our own projects that we're researching. But I think that's one pathway we could look at is how we could push together what, pull together what are our needs and how do we put that forward at the state level so it can help change those permitting pathways.
Great, thank you, Jen. Further comments? Right, Christy?
Yeah, just a quick comment, talking about roadblocks, and with DEP, it will be interesting to see how DEP grows with, as we, venture into this coastal resiliency in more of a, I'm a lot lost for words here. More under the circumstances as things get worse, it'll be interesting to see how they grow. But, to me, one of the biggest roadblocks is certainly funding. And I think that, the discussion about communities and counties getting together to lobby, for their portion of, funding from the state, from the feds, is very important. And I think will be critical as we grow with this coastal resiliency issue. And I think that, all communities happily, we have started, but, we need to really keep this in the forefront as we progress, even yearly. I know that long list of project that Vince is working on. And, last week we talked to, Brian said he put his head in his hands when he saw that. But it is just something that, as far as capital committee on our end, really just need to keep plugging away and showing that it is critical that we continue to fund this without even if we don't have fully specific projects to earmark funds to, it is critical that we keep this the funds or the accounts funded. So just a few comments there.
Thank you, Christy. A note, committee member Gary Beller was able to join us at 11:13. Gary, can you say a quick hello?
Hi, thank you.
Good to see you. I want to ask Claire Martin if she's available. Claire is from Remain, and they have sponsored the Envision Resilience Challenge, not only on Nantucket, but also in Rhode Island and another location coming up. I wonder, Claire, if you have any perspective on some of the challenges from state regulations, whether it's Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or elsewhere, that you might want to share in this context. And if I remember correctly, I think your instructions to the Envision Resilience teams were to ignore constraints, but I think you might still have a perspective on what some of those are.
Sure, thank you, Mary. We, as you said, the idea of Envision Resilience, when it began on Nantucket, the idea was not to be prescriptive. At the time, that was an intentional response to where we felt the community was in terms of, as this conversation has led us to, how, this working group, we know that we see the future in a certain way. We understand the projections. We know what we're facing. I think that there's a real disconnect among the general public. And that's what the challenge was intended to do, is to bridge that gap between where we are and where we need to be, and using those student designs as visuals of how we get there. So we really stayed away from policy and regulation, as you said, for the Nantucket Challenge. We really pushed the students to think outside of the box, to think innovatively, and not be held to those regulations. However, when we were in Rhode Island last year, during kind of our listening tour of engaging with community members and leaders, we heard that they were ready for, better able to receive visuals that could be implemented, maybe not tomorrow, but next year. So again, I'd like to reiterate, the Envision Resilience Challenge is not intended to inform policy in any way, but if that is a co-benefit outcome of this challenge, as we continue to do work within the New England region, that's a great outcome.
Thank you, Claire. It's really great to hear, from at any time and anywhere that the public is embracing the challenge of coastal resiliency. So I appreciate that. Further comments or questions? All right, so again, I want to open up to the public to see if there are any questions for any of the other speakers or suggestions for other ways we can explore the topic of policy change. If you remember the public in attendance, please go ahead and use the raise hand feature in Zoom or unmute and let us know that you have a question. All right, I'm not seeing any at this time. So one of the things that I felt was very interesting from the recent Keeping History Above Water conference that was held in Trinidad and Tobago was several of the panelists at the end of the conference mentioned the need to talk about loss. And to me, that fits in the context of the retreat policy. It's fine to say that we're going to retreat, we're going to remove something from harm's way. And the implication is that we're going to put it somewhere else. But there's another potential outcome, and that is that we're simply going to remove it, and it's not going to continue to exist in any location. And that's something that we don't talk about a lot, but I think would be part of the strategic retreat and relocation planning effort that Vince mentioned from the Coastal Resilience Plan. Any further thoughts on that topic as well? How we can put policies in place that recognize that some things will be lost. Peter?
Mary, can you clarify when you say it's removed completely, or you're talking about being demolished? I mean, if you're saying it's not going to exist anywhere else, that's pretty much demolished, right?
Yes, either not necessarily intentionally, but so for instance, when a natural disaster happens and something is demolished by nature, I'll think of the houses at Codfish Park back 20 years ago when they were lost in a storm. It was not something we anticipated, but we didn't make an effort to put them back in the same place, nor did we make an effort to build those cottages somewhere else. They simply ceased to exist. So not necessarily intentional demolition.
Well, one or two of them were moved inland, but yeah. Yeah, all right, I'm all set.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Greg?
Yep, thanks. So I know some of the other counties in the region, the Vineyard and Barnstable, have explored DCPC's, Districts of Critical Planning Concern. I'm not sure if Nantucket has done that before, but it's a very broad tool, but it can be used for coastal resilience. There are some areas that were looked at that you might be able to use it to identify certain areas that might not be rebuilt, that would be undeveloped, instead of doing like a transfer of development rights or something like that. But that's just a kind of a policy tool that's used for some of the other counties in the region.
Great, thank you, Greg. And very nice segue into Matt's question about transfer of development rights. Is there anyone on the call that has experience with implementing those in another jurisdiction? Or Matt, do you want to speak more about that in general?
I just want to bring it up as a potential way to, it's a potential way for us as a community to deal with some of these areas where people can donate the rights as they leave or be paid for the rights to build elsewhere, as long as we have, sort of giving and receiving areas that we've thought about and that we are allowing. So I think it's, rather than us having to pay everything, the market itself would take care of some of this. So if we had receiving areas in the Mid-Island at high ground, where owners in those areas could buy rights to increase the building from the giving areas, which are people are leaving because of sea level rise, et cetera, then we would be kind of further ahead. So I think it's something that, we should consider further. I like the DCPC idea, just critical planning. I think that's kind of what I'm talking about for when I say, let's look, I don't have the fancy words for it, but I That's what I'm talking about. We should be looking at neighborhoods and areas, looking at all the different options and coming up with sort of what do we need to do here and how are we gonna do it? So, you know, and I just think that TDRs are one of the, you know, sort of tools in our toolbox. If we don't, you know, if we sort of put it in place soon enough.
Thank you, Matt. Further comments? Yes, Greg?
So just a quick, this is not saying TDRs will not work, but some of the challenges with TDRs in coastal areas is just that the shorefront properties are so expensive compared to some of the inland areas that the ratio is very different. So not saying they can't, but it will be a challenge.
Thank you, Greg. My thought on moving people away from the shore is that most people who live on the shore do there specifically because it's a coastal property. That's why they chose that property. And so to get them to move to a property that is not on the shore presents a sort of an existential question. You know, how do you convince somebody that what they want is not what they want? It seems very difficult to me. Matt?
Yeah, but my point isn't that it's going to be, I'm talking about situations where people are gonna have to move, they have no choice, they're making the best of it. What can they, you know, then they're gonna look and say, okay, how am I going to, you know, how am I gonna get out of this as whole as I can? How am I gonna, you know, maybe I can donate, you know, maybe I can donate this property and we can have 10 or 15 more good years here. And I'm gonna donate it and get a great tax deduction now because it's still valuable. And I'm gonna donate easements and I'm gonna donate the property itself. And I'm not gonna build a second dwelling. I'm gonna sell the right to do another so many square feet to the Mid-Island. So this other person could build, you know, a few more apartments in the Mid-Island when they do it. And in 10 or 15 years, I'm gone. I'm looking at it more from that perspective than I am from oh, they're gonna get paid enough to leave. They're not going to, you know, that it's gonna be taken from them anyhow. And, you know, and I agree, it's gonna be difficult and people are going to, you know, oppose it and they're gonna come to the town and tell us that we have to build the roads and it's a requirement and we have to give them access. That's the, you know, that's the reality is people are going, you know, gonna be pushing for someone else to take care of it for them. But I'm saying, is there a way that we can have in place some market forces that help us a little bit? That's all, that's on that regard. And I think one thing we haven't touched on from, you know, sort of the state rule, one of the things that is a hindrance to us here, and maybe people can talk about it, is the state laws for ownership of roads. You know, once there's a road and it's a town road, we're required to, you know, to fix the town road and put the town road back in and et cetera. And it gives the homeowners leverage and we can't just abandon it. And it's a hard process to abandon. Is there any discussion at the state level? Does anyone know about changing those rules and making it more, you know, a little easier for municipality not to be, you know, building in places we shouldn't be building?
Thanks, Matt. Is anybody able to respond to that question? I would also look for any responses of how other jurisdictions have handled the question. Yes, Greg?
Yep, so don't mean to monopolize, but we had a scientist over at Rhode Island Sea Grant Law Center give some presentations at a couple of conferences on municipal liability for climate change. And there was several sections on, you know, municipal liability about abandoning roads. I don't have the exact details, but I know that scientist is now at the executive Office of Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts. So there is somebody in the state who is examining that. I don't know the status. It's been a couple of years.
Thank you, Greg. And by all means, you're here to present your information and opinion, so not monopolizing at all. Thank you for being here. Perhaps you can connect with Vince and he can follow up on that person. It would be wonderful to hear from them at our committee. Christy?
Yeah, I was just going to mention to Matt's question. I mean,
I understand about, roads divulging back to a private ownership, but I know that a lot of these roads, and Matt knows this well, that a lot of them do support infrastructure. It does give us more management over that. But I understand his point. I think it's a good one.
Thank you, Christy. All right, further comments on this topic? From commissioners, from speakers who have been invited today? Right, one thing that I did also hear, I think potentially was from Matt, but regarding Representative Dylan Fernandez, that he is pursuing legislation to change the ownership of the intertidal zone, which would have some impact on coastal resilience measures. Matt or Jeff, do you have any more information about that?
I don't have it handy. I definitely have it. I know he's been talking about adding kind of a use to that intertidal with the famous fishing, fouling, and navigating, of adding recreating to that. I guess the question is what that means for sure, and whether that will go through. I know it's something he's been talking about for a little while, but we'll have to see what happens. I think that's going to be a bit of a fight myself, but we'll have to see.
Thank you, Jeff. I guess finally, does anyone have information about federal regulations that either currently affect coastal resilience measures or affect, how things can be done or have any changes that they're aware of? Yes, Greg?
So again, I haven't followed up with the town lately enough. I'm not sure if you guys are undergoing a zoning bylaw update that there's, I guess it's not new guidance, it's better or more thorough enforcement of existing FEMA regulations, that pretty much every town in Massachusetts, their floodplain bylaw did not meet standards. So that had to go to all the town meetings. Not sure if you guys are doing that. We have folks who can help, no problem. But we also have some higher standards that could be included in that bylaw that aren't mandatory, but if you're going through the process, you could add them. So that just might help with some of the coastal resilience issues on that. There's also going to be land subject to coastal storm flowage, not with the state, but we're working with the Barnstable County group to come up. There's already a bylaw, but there's going to be some regs for the local conservation commissions. But mostly it was the federal FEMA floodplain bylaw I wanted to mention.
Thank you very much, Greg. Jeff, do you have any knowledge? Leslie unfortunately was not able to stay, so we can't ask her about the zoning.
I'd have to check with Leslie.
Okay. Let's go to Kim Rose and then Ian.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely look at the federal regulations as much as you can, because they do change and sometimes quietly, just to make sure that everything's in compliance, and also make sure that the policies and plans within the town are also in compliance with each other, and aren't contradicting or anything like that. I found that in a lot of different communities where, yes, their historic preservation department will be part of the planning department, but their plans will contradict one another. And so trying to rectify that is always a pain. But also with Nantucket being a national historic landmark, a lot of what was and a lot of what we flagged when I was working on the coastal resilience plan was Section 106. And going through the National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 process for different adaptations, things that you wanted to be added and that kind of stuff. And there are now technologies that are going through that federal process, such as one of the speakers that we had in Trinidad, Philip Todd. He works for Atlantic Reef Maker, which went through a Section 106 process because it was used to protect an archaeology site in North Carolina, which was along a main waterway. And so that technology got approved on the federal level. and can now be applied to other places because its impact was greater at protecting that resource and covering back up the archaeology that had been revealed by erosion processes. Then it had a detriment to the waterway and that kind of thing, which actually they found that it allowed oysters to grow on it. And so it cleaned the water. It allowed the wetlands and the mangroves to continue to expand. It allowed sand accretion and those kinds of things as well. And so it actually had this amazing natural effect as well, not only protecting that heritage, but also protecting the natural environment from the waves made by large shipping boats. But that Section 106 process is often seen as just another step, but sometimes it can be the motivation to solve the puzzle and to get creative and test boundaries. And that's something that what I love, even though, yes, there are a lot of regulations, especially in Massachusetts, sometimes they can create really inventive things. And yes, it may take a while to get it to pass and to get it to go through all of the channels that it needs to go through, and it may have to be tweaked. But it's amazing what I've seen come out of some of these communities that have higher regulations and the way that they work around them and with them and test those boundaries to get stuff done.
Thank you, Kim. And as soon as that Keeping History Above Water session is made available as a recording online, I will be sending that out to our committee members.
Perfect. Yay.
Ian?
Thanks, Mary. To Greg, I'm sort of astounded that you said every community in Massachusetts is out of FEMA compliance. Was that at a stroke of a pen or something? Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Greg?
So the way that happened, there were FEMA region representatives, and there was a staff change. And then either the new staff interpreted it slightly differently or noticed a section, and suddenly everybody in the state was out of compliance. So our Sea Grant program kind of started up a model bylaw just for the absolute minimums to get people back into compliance. And then the state saw what we were doing, kind of rolled everything into a larger project. So the state now does have a model bylaw that literally just needs to go to your town meeting to get approved. But then we have the higher standards, kind of an a la carte menu if you want to add stuff to it, since you're going to town meeting anyway. But yeah, staff change, and oh, look at that. Nobody's in compliance anymore.
Oh, great. Thank you for elaborating.
Thank you. Further comments and questions? Okay, if there are none, thank you very much to our guest speakers today. We really appreciate the conversation. And as mentioned, there might be a few follow-ups, so thank you for your time and attention. We will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is approval of minutes from January 10th and also from January 24th. I do have an edit for January 24th, so why don't we take those separately? Did anyone have comments or questions on the minutes for January 10th? And thank you to Rachel for supplying both of these.
Can you see these okay now?
Right, if there are no comments on the minutes, we'll take a motion to approve the minutes of January 10th. Gary, you're on mute, but that looked like you might be trying to make that motion.
Second.
You did, yeah.
All right, so moved by Gary, seconded by Matt. Roll call vote, Gary Beller,
Aye.
Sarah Boyce,
Aye.
Peter Brace,
Aye.
Matt Fee,
Aye.
Rachel Freeman,
Okay.
Ian Golding,
Aye.
Ken Carberg,
Aye.
Christy Kickham,
Aye.
Joanna Roach. Joanna, you're on mute. And I'm not hearing from Joanna. Joe Topham,
Aye.
Mary Longacre, aye. For the minutes of January 24th, Vince, thank you. So there is a comment attributed to me, and I don't think that it captured the intent, and certainly didn't capture the actual words. So I'm asking that that line be struck. I have to just pull it up to find it. And I'm not finding, of course. There it is. So this is on page 2 at the top, where it begins. Ms. Roach requested that there be a fact sheet developed to clarify the history of the Sconset Bluff project, as it is long and complicated. I'm asking to strike the next part where it says, but Ms. Longacre stated she did not feel that would be worthwhile. I did go back to the recording, and Joanne and I had a sort of a clarifying conversation, but I don't think I intended to say, and I certainly didn't specifically say, that I didn't think that that was worthwhile. Any comment on that change? If there are none, are there any other comments or questions on the minutes of January 24th? Can we get a motion to approve the minutes with the strikeout as shown on the screen?
So moved.
Thank you, Sarah.
Second.
Seconds, thank you, Matt. Roll call vote, Gary Beller.
I'll abstain since I was under surgery at the time.
Thank you, Gary. I'm glad to have you here today. Sarah Boyce,
Aye.
Peter Brace,
Aye.
Matt Fee,
Aye.
Rachel Freeman. Rachel,
Aye.
thank you. Ian Golding,
Aye.
Jen Carber,
Aye.
Christy Kickham.
I'm going to abstain. I was absent.
Thank you, Christy. Joanna Roach. I'm not sure if Joanna is back or not. I'm not hearing from her. Joe Topham
Aye.
and Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you all. Next item on our agenda is the discussion of upcoming meeting dates and topics. So we had originally planned to continue the concept of the focus topic meetings. And our next focus topic was the what should we do on the Sconset Bluff. However, we've run into a bit of a scheduling issue. The Select Board and Conservation Commission met and had a discussion about options for the geotube removal order. And they are meeting again on April 11th, but after our meeting. And Vince and I felt that it was not appropriate, since we have a Concom member and a Select Board member in our committee, to ask them to discuss that topic before they have their joint meeting later that day. So we will go back to a regular sort of meeting, and we'll develop an agenda for that. It will be April 11th at 10 a.m. The other question is whether or not it will be continued on Zoom or whether we will have to meet in person. As I understand it, there is now a bill on the governor's desk waiting for her signature or her rejection that would extend authorization for remote meetings. If that bill is signed, then I would anticipate that we will continue to meet via Zoom. If that bill is not signed or that current authorization expires as of March 31st, then we would have to meet in person. And most likely that would be in the trailer at 131 Pleasant Street. Is that correct, Vince? Yes, again, yes for Vince. So we will let you know as to location. Peter?
Yes, Mary. So if the bill doesn't pass, does that mean we can't have a hybrid meeting?
No, we could have a hybrid meeting. The two major changes that we would need to make, we would need to have a quorum in person in order for the meeting to be official, and the chair would have to be one of the people who was present in person. So we would be allowed to have remote participants in a hybrid format. However, there's a difficulty if we don't know that we're going to have a quorum in advance, because we don't know if people are going to try and Zoom in or appear in person. Then it becomes a little dicey as to whether or not we'll actually be able to hold a meeting. So my request, if we are required to meet in person, would be that each individual who is on island would commit to being in person. And any individual who would not be on island would let us know in advance so that we would know whether or not we'd have a quorum.
Speaking for the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board and now the Harbor Plan Update Committee, the hybrid model has been invaluable for us.
Yeah, but keep in mind that even with the hybrid, we have to have a quorum of members present in person. But no, I mean, we have advisory committee of non-voting taxpayer member, that, the ability to meet remotely has been tremendously helpful for that individual. And as we saw today, we frequently have guests who appear remotely. So we would definitely continue to have a Zoom component to accommodate them. Any other comments or questions? Gary?
Just a question. You mentioned that we're not going to talk about the Sconset Bluff issues because there's a meeting of the Select Board and the Conservation Commission.
Correct.
But if we're meeting after them, they're going to make a decision. So what good is our input after the fact? And I understand you're uncomfortable, and maybe Ian and Matt wouldn't talk at this time, but if they're going to make a decision, why are we going to meet afterwards? They'll have already made their decision.
They're not making a decision. And Vince, perhaps you can provide more background, but what I saw at the first meeting that they had was a specific requirement that they not make a decision because they were not meeting for that intent. And they were not meeting with public. It was a workshop meeting, if I'm right, Vince.
Correct.
They were not meeting with a public component. And so the idea was to have a focused discussion, much similar to what we've been doing. So the key point there, Gary, is that they will not be making a decision.
Yeah. And if I can, Mary?
Yes, please, Vince.
Just to, it was a facilitated meeting where an outside agency was brought in to run the workshop and find ways for both the Concom and Select Board to work better together and look at the potential future scenarios for the Bluff area and get both boards, if I could be so flippant, on the same page, so to speak. I hope that helps provide more clarity.
And that recording of that first meeting is available on the town's YouTube site. But because it was a workshop format, you don't have the full, I don't know what the right, you don't get the full view of what was going on. It is informative if you want to watch the recording. And I'm assuming that the April 11th meeting they have will also be recorded. And I think it would be wise for us to have at least viewed those two recordings as part of our deliberation process. Vince, anything you want to add on those meetings? No.
No, the first one was very well organized. There was a minor disconnect between how the meeting style was going to work and the technology available to record it. The first half of the meeting, it was a 2-hour meeting. The first hour thereabouts was workshop style, so people walking around. The recording managed to capture what happened in the room, but not all the conversations by any stretch of the imagination. The second half of the recording was the meeting was a general conversation, and all the participants were around the camera again, and that is very well captured. And it is worthwhile pointing out that the general tone of the meeting was positive.
Thank you, Vince. And Vince, I think you also said that the minutes of that meeting after they are approved will include some of the visuals that aren't available in the recording. Is that correct?
When we spoke, it was at the time. I had been requested to take pictures of all of the charts that were on the walls. And I'm now not as certain that they're going to be included in the minutes. But if anyone has questions, I have all of the materials available, and I can assist people to review those.
Thank you, Vince. So anyway, long discussion of what we plan to do at our next meeting. Joe?
Yeah, Mary, I was just thinking that we should get the link sent out and then have just a time sectioned off so we can really talk about just those meetings alone, and then kind of springboard off of that onto more conversation, more development of that, and kind of assist them in some ways. So I think that'd be helpful. And I have to drop off, so bye everyone.
Thank you, Joe. Any other comments about our upcoming meeting dates and topics? All right, if there are none, we can take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved.
I'll take Matt's motion, and Peter, do you want a second?
Sure.
All right, roll call vote. Gary Beller,
Aye.
Sarah Boyce,
Aye.
Peter Brace,
Aye.
Aye.
Rachel Freeman,
Aye.
Ian Golding,
Aye.
Ken Cardberg,
Aye.
Christy Kickham,
Aye.
Joanna Roach. I think Joanna must have left earlier. Joe Topham. Joe Topham dropped off, and Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you all. We will see you April 11th, either on screen or in person. We'll let you know.